extremely happy to be speaking in the context of this exhibition, which interested me very much, although I haven't seen it yet, in relation to the kind of publicity and readers and other material that already it has generated, and it seems to be still generating ideas which are very essential for as well for my work, etc. So I'm looking forward to kind of an interaction with the audience and with the discussant here later. Every form that the occupation has taken since 1967, when Israel actually occupied the area that you see here on the map, has been part of an attempt to end the occupation, right? So from the minute of the occupation, there's been an attempt to end the occupation. In fact, the only constant thing about the occupation are the fact that there are always attempts to end it. The geography of occupation is just physically shaped by the endless attempt to end it, or to put it more precisely, to give shape territorially, economically, and politically to its never-ending end. In fact, there's a kind of a sense that we are always at the edge, at the brink of a solution. You know, there's always some kind of plan, some kind of negotiations that make it appear as if just, you know, next year, next month, we are there with a certain kind of resolution to the problem of Palestine, which are in fact much larger than the geographical and temporal extent of the occupation. But everything that I will show you today could be seen and thought of in relation to its impending end, kind of scenarios for its end. Both the evacuation of Gaza, that we know has been the evacuation of settlements, of the ground control of Gaza, has been nothing but a kind of reorganization of the occupation of that strip. I mean, we know Gaza is still occupied, not now from the ground by ground presence, but more from the air over it and by the blockade that is organized all around it. As well, the wall that I will speak about today has been an attempt, at least in the way it is presented to the Israeli public, to give a certain form to the end of the occupation. So every attempt, every kind of period produces a scenario for ends, end up producing new mechanisms, new articulations in the mechanisms of domination and control, new physical vocabularies that are introduced into it. So, in that sense, I cannot see the occupation as anything else but its end, its constant end. And therefore, I'm very suspicious as well, politically, where a political program coming, say, from the left or center left in Israel or internationally is articulating itself around the slogan of end the occupation. This is, as I said, it's always produced simply new mechanisms, new systems of control. And in that, let's say, system of control and governmentality that is introduced in the occupied territory, there are two concepts that I'd like today to discuss with you. And they're somehow interrelated. One is temporariness and the other one is elasticity. So, in regard to temporariness, I could say that the entire logic of the occupation, as I've shown before, no, it's kind of never-ending end of the occupation, relies on a certain reading of temporariness. It is in fact the perception that the occupation is a temporary state that allow various forms of crimes to be argued that they are tolerated, or that could be tolerated, at least by the Israeli, let's say, liberal left within it. temporary encirclements and temporary closures, temporary transit permits and temporary revocation of transit permits, temporary enforcement of an elimination policy, and temporary change in open fire orders. No? But also legally, that definition of temporariness allows to legalize, according to the Israeli legal system, every form of violation within it. No? International law allows, in fact, in the context of a belligerent occupation, temporary suspension of rights for security. That kind of trade of temporary violation of right on behalf of a certain reading of security and what it is, security for whom and enacted by whom. So for me, elasticity is in space what that temporariness is in time. Elasticity organizes, in fact, these relations of temporariness. And I'd like to suggest as well that the physical realities of the occupation, although they seem hard enough and substantial enough, I mean, this is a colonial project with towns, cities, roads, walls, barriers, checkpoints built into it, that we need to see the geography of occupation and its transformation through the category of elasticity, i.e., a system that constantly reconfigures itself, that operates by reconfiguring itself, operate by the fact it is kind of unpredictable, right? That is constantly reorganizes the spatial relations within it. So I will do it through a number of anecdotes, in fact. Sorry, do you think I can have a glass of water? Perfect. Thank you. I underestimated my state. So we're going to maybe examine a series of anecdotes, vignettes, of physical transformation, physical negotiation in the occupied territories and read them through those categories. But first of all, you need to see where things are. So this is a map of the center of Palestine. Everything that is more color saturated is in fact within the area of Palestine that was occupied in 1967. The rest was occupied in 1948 with the establishment of the State of Israel and the creation, the ethnic cleansing of all that area and the creation of the refugee problem. But you see as well that the occupation has a very distinct urban, or maybe I should say suburban dimension. So that is the Tel Aviv metropolitan region. It is the main city in Israel, and these are its suburbs. But as well, it's all these settlements over here, and settlements are marked by blue, by those blue stains on the map, are part of its metropolitan region, let's say. And Jerusalem here, perhaps 80 to 100 kilometers apart, with these settlements functioning as its suburb. In fact, about 80 to 85% of all settlers are living in suburban relation to one of those main Israeli cities. But you see as well the absolute fragmentation that has been created between the Palestinian towns, cities, and villages here in brown spots on this map, and the kind of archipelago of very limited self-governed Palestinian area that are kind of separated, in fact, by the settlements. But in this map, I've marked an area a little bit north of Jerusalem, which is also a little bit east of Ramallah, where you see a certain bend in the road. Bends in the road are created, as you know, mainly because of topographical features. And indeed, there is a hilltop over that created that bend in the road that is considered by the settlers rather strategic. As you see in this image, there's no settlements, there's only Palestinian areas around it. And settlers tried to take control of that hilltop for a long time, but didn't manage to do it simply because the hilltop was privately owned and cultivated by Palestinians. And you see the olive groves here and a certain fields for grazing over here. And it is still within the mechanism by which the occupation were difficult to grab private land, although not impossible. Also, I want to kind of emphasize the fact that the state itself has signed several international agreements that's given guarantees to the US and Europe and otherwise not to build new settlements. And therefore, and this is what creates that situation of elasticity that I'm talking about, has withdrawn its control, or seemingly withdrawn its control, allowing various forces, various interests to kind of play and organize the geography of occupation. So settlers resorted to various systems of piracy in order to establish new points on the landscape in areas that they found strategic. In this particular case, they've complained that during 20 seconds, while they drive round a bend in this road from this point to this point, they lose reception on their mobile phone. That space-time is what allows, they claimed, for them to be attacked without having the possibility to call for help. And they've appealed to a mobile phone provider, an Israeli international mobile phone provider called Orange, that you know very well, to build an antenna on this hilltop. So because they could have argued that antenna on that hilltop as a security matter, because of this 20-second space-time that is, let's say, kind of like a black hole of security, that they have been allowed to temporarily annex the hilltop in order to temporarily put an antenna on it. So right now we're not only talking about a topographical feature, but one that is charged with infrastructure, right? Because there need to be electricity that serves this antenna, and water has been directed to this hilltop to allow it to build the concrete foundations, no? So there's a nexus of infrastructure on this topography. Furthermore, the antenna is rather expensive, and Orange has paid for a 24-hour guard to move in a shipping container to live by the antenna in order to guard it. That guard has been able to connect his shipping container to the water and electricity that serves the antenna. So life was rather comfortable. And he fenced himself off, or in fact fenced off the hill from its owners around that path, and felt safe enough to bring his wife and kids to the hilltop to live with him. After a while, his friends came over, and the settlement of Migron was inaugurated. What I want to say here is that you see how space is produced not only through top-down government planning, but through the intersection of various interests, no? Settlers, illegal according to Israeli law. All settlements are illegal, obviously, according to international law. Corporate interests, etc. Security discourse. In fact, you would see in many of those outposts an antenna at the center, because the logic of cellular communication is oddly compatible with that of the civilian occupation, both of them seeking to create a certain triangulation of high points across either site or electromagnetic radiation lines. So these are becoming kind of like stimuli for outposts to be created. But some later on, a suburban community would actually solidify around that mobile phone antenna. So bringing those caravans around hilltops. It's not only around antennas, no? I mean, this is just a certain excuse. Is almost kind of like the ultimate tool of colonization, because a whole seed for a town could be created within a few hours, and then, of course, also evacuated, because these outposts are exactly kind of a magnet for the Israeli center left, let's say the anti-occupation left, to protest and to say why there is a new outpost. In fact, one of a person that I know very well has been able to take trucks, and in that outpost that I first showed you, put 5 of those mobile phones, steal 5 of these mobile homes on that track, and drop them at the center of Tel Aviv in front of the building of the Ministry of Defense in order to demonstrate that evacuation is possible. So there are kind of like points of conflict across the landscape, no? Of independent oppositional organizations, of settlers. Here you see a kind of a government operation for the evacuation of one of these outposts. But most often, the caravans are just being put back on trucks and just being relocated to another location, right? So the geography is constantly getting reorganized, constantly changing, no? It doesn't work here, it is moving there, etc. But I guess I'm showing as well these the mobilization of the settlers themselves to resist evacuation is a kind of example that for me now becomes relevant as suburban communities in the US are losing homes to completely another process of repossession, etc. But we've seen nowhere resistance. And this is maybe something that I'd like to return to. Why that economical evacuation of suburban community in the US is seen only as an economical issue and not as a political issue, where I believe should be seen as a political issue, and if there's any inspiration to take from the settlers, is that kind of fierce resistance to evacuation that could be articulated in these images. Obviously, these outposts later solidify into suburban communities according to a certain logic that takes vision as well. It's one of its main kind of instruments. I called it in the book optical urbanism or optical suburbanism, where you see a settlement on a hilltop built in concentric rings in a way that each one of the houses is looking at a different place within the landscape, diffusing the source of vision to the community rather than to one person or body, and obviously overlooking the landscape around it, which is most often a kind of Palestinian town or here a refugee camp. No? So there are optical devices as well in creating that kind of vision, covering the landscape with the optical logic of surveillance, whose kind of contemporary manifestation is the mobile phones, right? But if we think through this category of elasticity and look at this map, the same map that I showed in the first slide, only that I've taken all place names and roads, etc. from it, just to be left with the forms themselves. In fact, to be true to this map, one should be able to press play on it and let those forms, in fact, this is 2002, but every kind of articulation of politics in that region is registered either in the form of settlements or the areas under their control or the areas under the control of Palestinians. In fact, what I want to say is that elasticity allows form to become a certain index for, that kind of demonstrate in its contour line, in its form, the political force field around it, no? Any change in the political force field changes these very complex forms. And in fact, we could read every twist and turn in the forms that you see here as a diagram of those political forces. Therefore, architecture becomes important as an ability to read politics through the way it is solidified into form. But obviously, it's a dynamic map, no? It rearticulates anew through this sort of elastic geography the changing force relations around it. In fact, if there would be no resistance to the occupation, no legal resistance, no military resistance, no political, diplomatic, international, all this area would have been long ago just blue. That complex diagram that you see, it's a result of a constant conflict, no? It's a diagram of power relations in conflict. And maybe that is something that we can pick up later in relation to certain Foucauldian reading of space and social relation, to the idea that kind of war, the idea of conflict and war is a structural part of social relation, etc. I think that every, and these are actually the peace plans, no, that have been presented through the years. The Oslo Accord of 2002-2003, the generous offer by Prime Minister Barak in 2000 in Camp David. Each one of those plans is simultaneously peace plans, right? Is also a settlement plan, because settlements would occur. So if the areas in dark here are areas that are offered back to the Palestinians of the occupied territories, everything else becomes a zone of activity, of endless activity, of construction, right? So every peace plan is a settlement plan and also a partition plan, no? So we have them here. This is more or less the situation right now, where a complete perforation of a political body is actually undertaken by the settlements themselves. Now, the problem was a little bit with the economy, the economical sustainability of such geographical system. I mean, as you know, since the Oslo Accord, Israeli economy has been growing steadily. No? Now, obviously, it kind of responds to the international financial crisis, and Palestinian economy has been contracting steadily, simply because of the roadblock, the denying of the possibility of previously about half of the Palestinian labor force to work in Israel. So Palestinian economy has been contracting while Israeli economy has been extending. Palestinians have not stopped being employed as producers in the Israeli economy, but remain consumers within it, no? Simply because the kind of the tax and custom envelope is around the whole space under Israeli control, right? So what you can see within Palestinian shop is only Israeli products. Some of them, the products that Israelis would not buy, that are actually being pushed to Palestine. So Palestinians are part of the Israeli economy as consumers, and that the money for that is coming from the kind of very large international donations into Palestine that are in fact, in a sort of roundabout way, support Israeli economy. It seems that now the problem of ending the occupation, and this is now Netanyahu's kind of promise, and he's probably the next Israeli prime minister, and the next plan is to turn the occupation productive economically. The question is how to turn this kind of endless islands, this archipelago of incarceration, no, in the West Bank. Each one of those islands is rather secluded, separated either by the wall or by checkpoints from others, right, into an economically productive entity. How to put the Palestinians back to work is seen as a kind of a disciplining project that would take them away from active military resistance, but also for the settlers themselves. I think the idea most could be grasped in a perhaps graphic way as kind of offshoring at home, no? Kind of, you know about that one of the most common neoliberal sort of default action is to create those special enterprise zones or tax-free zones. No, sometimes they are on islands such as Jersey, Guernsey, etc. Sometimes islands in the Caribbean. No, we have here an artificial archipelago that allows a kind of creation of special zones, each one with its own particular spatiality of production. Both the settlements themselves, in which the industrial zones become high-tech zones, for example here, that obviously can produce and compete with Far Eastern production because the price of land is zero. No? I mean, this is stolen land. No? So a factory can be produced for very cheaply, mainly in these settlements populated by ultra-Orthodox Jewish families. As well, the price of labor is rather cheap. And a lot of high-tech companies have taken, have used that in creation of that kind of zones. But as well, the turning of the Palestinian islands, this kind of archipelago of incarceration, into a productive economy by giving each city different type of easement, no? In one VAT suspended, in the other taxes over that, in the other type of incentives, special enterprise zone. The archipelago of prison is becoming an archipelago of special enterprise zones that is completely nourished and is preconditioned on being just beside an incredibly dense and poor Palestinian areas where unemployment is over 50% now, right? So the people in that refugee camp would work for nothing within that enclave and would be policed very conveniently by the Palestinian Authority and the Israeli military as a kind of this attempt that by the Israeli government, which is supported by Europe. And if you don't see the geography, you just don't understand what is happening. It's all kind of wrapped with rhetorics of peace and improvement of conditions that is, in fact, attempting to create, the assumption is that if Palestinian economy is now going to grow in sort of Chinese scale of like 10 to 12% annually, that is going to create another political subject, much more docile political subject that is not so inclined to fight, right? Obviously, I think those are the people that have made that calculation assume that it is only the Palestinian poor that take part in the armed struggle. And I think that many serious studies of that show that it's absolutely not correct. The armed struggle is being sort of contributed to from all parts of Palestinian society, including the urban bourgeoisie, so to say. Other kind of transformation in the logic of the occupation are about privatizing the very instruments of control and domination, no? And one of the most apparent one of those is the checkpoint system that is now being overhauled, subcontracted to private companies, and designed according to principles that have humanitarian as almost the constant adjective to any design move that is undertaken. So you have humanitarian checkpoints and humanitarian gates and humanitarian officers and humanitarian waiting room, humanitarian toilets, I don't know what. I mean, everything is humanitarian now in the logic of the occupation. And the kind of constant, tool, the ubiquitous tool that is part of that new organization, the sort of civilizing of the control system of those checkpoints is the turnstiles, no? I mean, those rotating gates, whose aim is actually to transform a kind of a formless mass of incarcerated people into an ordered line, no? And this is done by remotely controlling them and allowing one person at a time to cross, turning a kind of a shapeless mass into a straight line as various types of checks are undertaken. In fact, in Israel right now, the standard for rotating gates for turnstiles is 80 to 85 centimeters radius of the arm, right, as it turns. I think it's internationally like that. In Palestine, these companies have been asked to reduce the diameter of the hand of the turnstile to 55 centimeter, right? Presumably to press against the body of the Palestinian who's crossing it to make sure she or he has nothing on their body, right? So that kind of transformation, no, from 85 to 55, that happens only in Palestine, and I think in Nottingham, in that particular turnstile that you have at the exit here. It's probably the smallest one I've seen in Europe. Are embodied this whole kind of, sort of politics of the body, no, that is, and control of the body that is undertaken. All sort of other improvements, like putting roof over waiting rooms so the Palestinians would not stand in the rain as they are about to cross the checkpoint. Bring to mind that kind of incredible way by which the opposition to the occupation, as I've said before, has become a partner in the design of its mechanism. So protest by Israeli center-leftists, on the horror of the checkpoints, on the mess in there, on the arbitrariness of them, have allowed to produce a much more regularized and regulated, much more humanitarian system that makes the crossing almost kind of like a pleasant crossing of an international border, etc., and somehow normalize that economy of the occupation. Another issue of elasticity is obviously connected to the way in which the Israeli military sees and operates within urban Palestinian environment. Here, the refugee camp of Balata, next to Nablus. In fact, an image that so clearly demonstrate what the Israeli army call its nightmare scenario. Too dense, too confusing, impossible to navigate within it. An area saturated with not only civilians, international, media, human rights organizations, different types of NGOs, etc. A hyper-complex environment in which the military-owned telecommunication system cannot even operate. How to understand it, how to operate within it, in fact, has been one of the main kind of problems for the Israeli army, as it understood that in order that its urban warfare must be a form of urban design. No? It must kind of understand the city in a way, or the urban environment in a way that perhaps planners or urban theorists do, and therefore started to read a lot of the theories that were produced in architectural urban schools, etc. And I have a long chapter in the book about that. And so here, I hope it works now. It didn't before. It's an interview with somebody who is the head, or was the head, of that architecture school for Israeli soldiers. And I decided to show it because of this physical resemblance to Foucault. In fact, he's called in Israel Foucault on steroids. So I'm asking him, what are soldiers reading in those schools, urban schools? He doesn't want to. He says, we read Christopher Alexander, we read Deleuze and Guattari, we read a lot of post-colonial theory, etc., etc., and he kind of find himself rather amusing saying that. And this is one of his slides that actually demonstrates and shows in this sort of square of opposition various Deleuzian terms, difference and repetition, rhizomes, nomadic terrorists, etc. Wherever you look, a lot of it is just kind of rubbish to impress soldiers trying to impress themselves. But in fact, the system of swarming that they have conceived allowed them to enter Palestinian towns, cities, and villages without accepting their urban syntax as such. So not moving. What is the urban syntax? It's the roads, it's the streets, the alleys, courtyards, stairwells, stairs, corridors inside, sequences of rooms, no? This is how we order and understand, rationalize our cities. But by moving through walls or through floors and ceilings, sometimes 100 meters long paths through the urban fabric, you start reconceiving this relation of inside and outside, and completely inverting the urban syntax, moving through walls, bringing the war into the very intimate, private domains of Palestinians who sometimes sit. I have a quote from that lady who is describing the horrific experience of sitting in the living room watching television together with her family while the wall starts crumbling and a door, a kind of a hole appears, and 10 soldiers move into her flat and then just make a hole in the other wall and just move without even kind of interfering with the domestic life in it. But the minute, if it is about syntax, the minute some of these holes are actually made, they can never be used twice. They become part of the syntax of the city. Therefore, any other movement through that space would have to make another hole, right? Because through that hole that already exists, that could be already a place where a Palestinian resistance fighter could look, could wait for them on the other side. And cities, whole cities, such as this one, referred to as Chicago, in homage of another city which is bullet-ridden. It's a city that, a ghost town, that is made for the Israelis to train in the desert, in urban warfare, as well the Marines as well. And you see the way in which holes are already cut into the buildings themselves, meaning that what is being not accepted is the kind of the syntax of the city. Every movement is actually reconfiguring the body as it moves through space, recreates it, reorganizes it. And new innovation in surveillance and operational technology that allows soldiers to actually see bodies through walls, through opaque walls, and later special kind of weapons that allow them to shoot through the wall without the bullet head deflecting, right? In fact, rendering architecture completely transparent and permeable, no? That's kind of form of stripping out of architecture into its only essence here is to locate bodies in space, no? Right? While the wall offers no protection, not to privacy, not that. Everything that is solid is melted into the screen of that radar, etc. And I think these would have one of the most fundamental effects on the relationship between war and architecture. No, I mean, in a sense, that kind of evaporation of the last constant of architecture, the wall, that is both permeable and transparent, is the embodiment of that type of elasticity of space that I'm talking about. But then you would come and say, I'm kind of trying to preempt a question that will no doubt come, that the wall, this solid, horrible, 12-meter high concrete panels that make the wall, how can we see them in terms of any theory of elasticity and temporariness? No, I mean, this is the manifestation of permanence. what I'll try to show in the following anecdote or kind of analysis of a particular case is how the wall itself, the path of the wall, is constantly negotiated and renegotiated. How every twist and turn of its shape becomes a diagram of pull and push forces, of micro forces, micro politics around it. Because never has the Israeli government, or Sharon for that matter, drawn a sketch of the wall and then finally somebody came and built along that. The idea of separation has been introduced into the heart of the West Bank, of the occupied areas. This is not separating Israel from the West Bank. It's built through the West Bank. The idea, but then the minute it started to hit the ground, you know, settlers' council on the one hand, international diplomacy on the other, some legal action on the other, etc., kind of started configuring, pushing and pulling that line until it kind of dries out in a particular location, and even then could be dismantled and removed. Here you see an outpost has been located at one of those hills in order to make that tongue, that loop that would encapsulate it inside, right? There's a relationship between the outposts and the path of the wall. The path of the wall reacts to locations, to changing realities on the ground. So this is an expropriation order from 2003 that is connected to the very first case that the wall was actually debated in the Israeli High Court of Justice. Everything within this, in this map between those two red lines is area to be annexed, to be seized temporarily by the state of Israel from a private owner of a farm, let's say, through his land, her land, in order to build the wall. In fact, it was the first time, and it was a very difficult decision for a lot of those farmers to group together and to go to court to protest the seizure of the land, although the state said temporarily, no, for security reason. No, there was a kind of a protest, organized protest around that. And that introduced for the first time to court a lot of visual language and different technologies and presentation techniques. Like, I mean, you know, you can take a picture in court only before the judges come in. No? And this is a trial I worked on for a long time because it interests me, the kind of the scenario and the mechanism within that. They had to argue that, in fact, the wall should not be where it is because, you know, their land is on the wrong side of it. So there will be a farmer whose land is on the other side of the wall and could not cultivate it, etc. But the judges, seeing those visual representations, sorry, I think it's my mobile phone, simply did not understand the complicated language of geography. And as an architectural teacher says to a second-year student, go home, bring a model. And they asked the human rights team, the team that was working for the Palestinian farmers, to go home and bring a model to court. They suspended the trial for about 10 days. They did not know how to produce a model. Human rights teams do not have usually that capacity. And they were looking for some people to produce a model. The first model of the wall to ever been built would be built by the human rights team, who found, in fact, a military company specializing in various tools of training for the army and planning to produce a model of the wall for them. And they have, digitally, and delivered it to the legal team. This is the office of Muhammad Dakhle, who is the lawyer for the villagers. So what happened on this model? No, it's very interesting to see. This is the green line. It is the internationally recognized border of Israel. So everything on its left is the area occupied in 48, and on the right, that international community recognizes as Israel or Israel proper. Everything right of it is the area occupied in 67, which is considered occupied land. I mean, you see, these are political definition. The red line is the line along which the state already started to build a wall. And in blue, the human rights team have actually asked some military advisor to help them design a better wall. A wall that, although still in the occupied area, is annexing a little bit less of the fields of these farmers, no? So they've proposed a wall, they said to me, not because we wanted to propose a wall, but because in order to render the red line illegal, we needed to show that according to international law, there is a more proportional, alternative to it, no? At one point, and this is actually quite interesting for me in terms of the whole rhetorics of thinking around these type of action and participation in design. So you see again here the green line, that is 48 Israel, 67. You see the wall actually slips over to the other side, right? They made a trick in the model. They said, well, if it is only about security, the wall, and it's not a political wall, it's not a political border, we need to absolutely adhere to security considerations, no? And in this case, the hill, as you see, is on the Israeli side of the line, so therefore build it on your ground. Let's take it both ways, no? That was a kind of like slippage they introduced into that negotiations. So the model was called in to court after 10 days of suspension, but it was the first time ever that the model was called into court. So the porters didn't quite know where to put it in that courthouse. It was just not built for that. They found a table. They brought a table from the cafeteria. Somebody with a little bit of intuition, and they've placed it at the center of this courtroom. Sorry, there are no pictures because it's a court session. But they put it there, but obviously the judges were sitting a little bit too high on their bench. Well, not too high, they were sitting on their bench. The table, a normal kind of 80 centimeter high cafeteria table, was too low for them to see from their bench. But judges are otherwise not allowed to go off from the bench. But for the first time ever in these type of courts, they have actually stepped down. So, usually you say that you don't know if the judges even have legs, no? They've stepped down. They show their sneakers and whatever, and called both parties in, no? So effectively, what you had was a kind of like a participation session, no? That completely changed the language within which court cases are argued. There's a way to speak to a judge, and there's a way to speak to your colleague, and everything is honorable, and etc. I don't know exactly the terminology in English, but you surely know it. And people just talked into each other, and there became a certain commotion where the different types of walls and options were discussed, and the modelers were started producing, and I have the whole transcript of this in the work that I've produced around that, a certain military language, because even some people in the human rights team were soldiers in the Israeli army. The judges obviously have been the side representing the state, and the army obviously. So they all kind of started enjoying it, no? Like designing the new wall, pushing it, pulling it, making that kind of participatory session, discussing different types of weapons and different types of security considerations until they've agreed. So in fact, you see, here, if the wall is going to ever become international border of a sovereign Palestinian state, it's going to be the first border in the world that's been designed by human rights activists, resisting the occupation. And this is when the judges came out, and you see the discussions continue. I think that this kind of elasticity, that principle of elasticity, is simultaneously empowering and frustrating. No, it's empowering for activists because they see that work on the ground, no, you can sometimes, rarely, remove an outpost, and you can change the path of the wall. So there's something empowering about it, no? That idea of elasticity allows a participation, no, of various agencies. It's not only the state on the one hand and the Palestinian Authority on the other. No, it's a multiplicity of various organizations, no? Like I say, some settlers as well managed to change the path of the wall in their advantage, etc. So kind of the force field is complex and effective. But as well, as one of the lawyers of this case has told me, he feels like the architect of the wall. No, in fact, human rights people become the architects of that. So this is kind of like something about the new phase of the occupation, which is, in a sense, having humanitarianism as one of its principles. Oh, what's that doing here? Gaza, 2005. I had the opportunity, because I was invited by the Palestinian Ministry of Planning to participate in discussion regarding the fate of Israeli settlements that would be evacuated. You remember the evacuation of the settlements, 2005 in Gaza. So there were some months between April 2005 and August 2005, nobody knew exactly what's happening. And although the operation was a unilateral Israeli operation, there was a huge amount of diplomatic activity undertaken through the language of architecture. The question was really what to do with that, or how to understand the single family house. What does it mean? What could it be used for? It was the opinion of the, let's say, more right part of the Israeli government, Netanyahu again, that homes should not be delivered intact, no? Should be destroyed. And the reason that was given to it was something to do with the way architecture functions politically. To deny an image, a political image of possible transformation, Arabs should not live in homes of Jews, because that is a certain reversal, and thus could point to a certain reversibility of a Zionist project that is otherwise typified by Jews living in homes of Arabs, no? Taking over their property, displacing them, etc. So it could be a crack, no, in the kind of colonization project of Palestine, complete. No? And this, I think there's quite an interesting understanding of architecture that I can agree to. Yes, that image would have a political power, no, as it kind of circulates around. And in fact, more than that, it would appeal to a lot of people whose, or be a nightmare scenario for a lot of suburban dwellers, who actually at the heart of the suburban project is that idea of, kind of a little sort of civilized world against the chaos that it is itself created, no? That it sort of barricades itself, whose walls are now collapsing, with the pressure of this third world that is coming inside, no? That kind of idea of the sort of domesticity in danger, etc. On the other hand, other kind of things that I experienced, I was sitting, it was like absolutely bizarre. I was sitting in this big room in the Palestinian Ministry of Planning. There were international delegations from everywhere. There were the World Bank, the IMF, the Quartet, the EU, the UN, etc., etc. A lot of people, a lot of young people coming with, representatives of this organization, coming with ideas about these homes, what to do with them, how to understand architecture, what to demand from Israel, etc., etc. It was quite strange because then still, legally, people had to have bodyguards when they went to the West Bank. So you had, every delegation was doubled, no? So you didn't know who is the IMF representative and who is the bodyguard. Usually they were both kind of like men in their 30s dressed in suits, And it was kind of very sort of interesting and confusing situation. The Americans demanded quite strongly from the Israeli government that homes will be left intact. And that is another understanding of architecture that was at the basis of that. Homes, Condoleezza Rice was saying at the time, would help kind of transform, again, maybe the term is mine, Palestinian political subjectivity. No? What would better befit an American agenda that is otherwise typified, that seeks to civilize the Middle East into a broad-based middle-class values and having Palestinian living in American-style gated communities. So the idea was that that would kind of, somebody like the founder of the Levittown was once said, no, anyone that owns a house could never be a communist. There's too much to do. Would be as well a part of a certain political project operating on the level of subjectivity, of production of subjectivity. There were other very bizarre suggestions. There was Muhammad El-Akbar, who was the CEO of a very large development company in Dubai, Nakhil. In fact, he's the guy that plays the equivalent role of Donald Trump or Sugar. Sugar is here, no? Alan Sugar, no? In The Apprentice, no? In the kind of local Al Arabiya version. So kind of like the image of real estate capitalists, no? Who came to Palestine at the time and wanted to transfer all settlements. In fact, he wanted to buy all that area for very cheap, for $36 million, and turn the settlements into some kind of holiday resorts in what he called the best beach in the Middle East, and have them served by the international airport with a corridor and keep the fences and everything around it, obviously offering jobs for Palestinians, and everything will trickle down. I don't know what the economical jargon of that was. At the time, working for the Palestinian Ministry of Planning, we felt that all these ideas to privatize that property that would be handed back would rob the Palestinian of something that they deserve as a public, especially since so little public land is available in Palestinian cities, and especially in Gaza. So we had a rather kind of bizarre, I would say, plan. As well, it was based on a certain reading of colonial history that kind of looks at what happens to the architecture of colonial power at a time or after a time of decolonization, no? And kind of understanding that the attitude towards architecture in that period is somehow drawn between two contradictory desires, no? On the one hand, there is the kind of the popular urge to destroy, to burn that architecture which was the instrument of colonization, the enactment of racist ideologies, the stealing of land, etc. So architecture must burn as a kind of an act of cathartic liberation. Whereas, on the other hand, the government's aim usually was, the problem of governing. No, I mean, we need infrastructure. We need that. Was actually to use that architecture and infrastructure. It's not only physical, no, legal, etc., organizational. In a very same way that the colonizers did. Therefore, military camps would remain military camps, police stations, prisons as prisons, villas as villas for the new bourgeoisie, etc., etc., no? But with the problem of a certain reproduction of power hierarchies in space that are not challenged, no? And in that context, having the settlements operated as gated communities for the Palestinian bourgeoisie would reproduce a certain alienation, no? Would not make a break in history, but somehow continuity with that logic of the occupation. We thought that there must be another alternative, and that for us was to use those settlements, but not in the way that they were designed for, but to cast into their evacuated shells different programs that would completely redefine them. And, we had some very mundane proposals. We took 3 isolated settlements and thought that they could become the nucleus of a certain public institutions that were needed. This one, Morag, for example, as an agricultural university where the single-family homes of the settlement would now become classrooms, etc. But as well, an institution would operate very differently if it is finding itself in a shell, in a built shell that is different than, you know, I don't know, kind of a big buildings with floors, etc. No, I mean, it would define as well what the institution is, a certain cultural center in another that we proposed, etc. As you know, either responding to its own destructive inertias or not wanting to have the settlers come back to homes, Israel has destroyed about 3,000 homes in the 21 settlements of the West Bank. You know that buildings are as well solid toxic waste, no? And the minute that you destroy them, you release all this toxic component into the ground. And Gaza is at the end of it's downstream in terms of the water ecosystem in Palestine. And therefore, it kind of, the contamination of its water, this is what it gets, no? I mean, it basically kind of ruins the large water aquifers on which it was sitting, making them toxic. So although there's incredible pleasure, and I love watching this video again and again in kind of this destruction of this horrible suburbia, no? This kind of moment where you feel, yeah, you know, it is you know, in a sense, we can get rid of that. It's been an absolute environmental catastrophe in Gaza. Obviously, a lot of those leftovers were recycled later by Palestinians, but a complete sort of apocalyptic landscape has been created with now the most recent project of all the ruins of 40 years of occupation in Gaza, no? So imagine 3,000 homes, public institutions, schools, military bases, any type of building that is around is kind of turned into gravel and now being pushed and wheeled into the Mediterranean to form a giant jetty, a kind of like a wave breaker around, which is going about 800 meters in, 400 meters north, parallel to the shore, to create a wave breaker for a place where finally, hopefully, one day, the deep sea port of Gaza would be built. But it is not obviously having security clearance from Israel, so it's not being built. But this image of this incredible landscape feature, is kind of like an embodiment of that possible future of this suburban project. But then, you know, no destruction is actually perfect. And even when contractors are allowed to destroy everything, some buildings were in fact remained. And this is a great image for me. I mean, this is really an image of hope. A Hamas university built within buildings that were left in one of those settlements, absolutely immaculately taken care of. No, I mean, this is a square where otherwise, you know, buildings were built, were located. No, it's a university, of course. They learn theology as well, but as well engineering and other languages, etc. It's a university, and I find in that a real kind of moment of hope that architecture could be transformed, could take over other functions, etc. Right now, in fact, I've kind of like changed a little bit the mode of my work. I've set up an office in Palestine together with two people that in fact exhibit in this show and should have been here today, Sandy Hilal and Alessandro Petti. We have a kind of a very new, fragile, I would say, office in Bet Sachur, a town next to Bethlehem, where what we do is we look and we plan the possible afterlife of what we call the future archaeology of the occupation. No, what could the evacuated, destroyed or not destroyed, areas in the settlement could actually be used for? And although architecture and planning usually needs a very stable ground, you need a site, a timeline, a budget, a client. Here we have nothing. No, I mean, in fact, we do not even want to work with the Palestinian Authority that is now an unelected body that has no legitimacy, but we work by setting up programs in universities. We work on a civil society level in collaboration with various NGOs. And we've set up our office as a residency program where people, if some of you want to talk about it, people come and work with us and in fact live in that office. So this kind of indeterminacy of the ground on which we plan and work means that we don't know which settlements will be evacuated, when, if, etc., in what order. So we cannot work, and we do not want to work on a master planning level. And we decided to take the house, or the kind of the scale of architecture, as our operative scale. So although there are, I don't know, about 200 settlements and military bases in the West Bank, and about 500,000 built structures, the number of typologies is rather limited. These are like tract houses, no? So these are variation on a single or double family houses, no? So unlocking the potential of in this kind of re-inhabitation of the single family house would allow us to think even beyond the occupation itself into processes of decolonization that could reverse forms of inhabitation, no, without kind of confining us to a geographical position, no. So because these are occurring in different places, no. Just something to show you the kind of the level of animosity to architecture, photographed by Reinhard Krauss, a German photographer, of a parade in Gaza, where, you know, an Israeli flag, an American, a doll of Bush would be burned, obviously. But here, what they're going to burn is an architectural model. You know, and it interests me, for me, that as part of that voodoo ritual, architecture is such a, you know, kind of captures the imagination in such a way. But as well, that level of animosity toward that particular architecture means that that project could not as well, you know, that it has to have this sort of broad base, it has to exist. The discussion of could those houses be reused, should they be reused, how they should be converted, need to take place not only according to the technical language of architecture and planning, but really by inaugurating a certain arena of speculation that operates on a kind of social political level. We're looking at particularly into that colony called Psagot, built beside Ramallah here, very, very close to it, which is in fact embodying another paradox. It is both urban and suburban, right? It's suburban according to the Israeli geography. It's 25 minutes from Jerusalem. It's connected with highways to it. But it's urban if you think about it in relation to Ramallah, which is there. You can walk to it. This is the last house from the fence of the settlement. You can basically just walk into Ramallah. Wow, and we think whatever happened there it will always still be both urban and suburban. Another, I don't know, more artistic art image that was sent to us, a photograph. This is not Palestine, obviously. It's somewhere either very north or very south. And anyway, it's somewhere very cold. It can even be a model. I'm not sure, but it doesn't matter, no? Because what we've learned from it is something that is kind of interesting for us. In a transformation of suburbia from a multiplication of privately owned house and garden into a public institution, what is very interesting and important for us is the surface in between the houses. What happened here, what is quite remarkable for us about this image, is that a very thin layer of snow that has fallen, I don't know, it looks like not more than 20, 30 centimeters. It's completely erased all the differences in the surface of what I imagine, may have been there otherwise, no? Maybe roads, sidewalks, maybe not even, no? But let's imagine, no? Private gardens with a little bit of demarcation, no? Everything is erased rather brutally, fantastically, abstractly into this layer of whiteness that is just flowing under this settlement. And we were thinking that, in fact, the homes of the settlements, this is not the architectural problem. Architecture is finally rather dumb, no? And everybody knows how to take a structure like that and adapt it either to his or her house or to, open up some walls, etc. You don't need an architect for that. But ideology and the function of the urban space is really happening in its first 15 centimeters of ground. This is what we call the urbanism of the first 15 centimeters. Right? The first 15 centimeters of the city designate private and public, walk, no walk. This is where control, in fact, through the environment is exercised, no? The house is somehow, of course, there's, family hierarchies and all that, and all the conflict of the house is built into the way it is organized. But that is, whereas like erasing the surface as the first act seemed to us to open a potential to use that space differently, and could either be by covering some of the roads with a fresh layer of earth and creating a smooth surface that connects. But in fact, that image of the house that is disconnected from the ground without moving it, without touching it, no? Just by affecting the ground itself, opens up new connection. You can walk from this house to any other one, no? You don't need to follow the linear folds of the road and sidewalks, no? They become like objects. Is rather interesting for us. Also, we decided, sorry, am I over time?
Getting there, I think, yeah.
How long do you think I still could have? 5, yeah? Okay. You said a long lecture. I always think that you need to talk longer than the time it takes you to get to a place, no? Otherwise. So what is that? 1 hour and 35 minutes is the train from London to...
With the Q&A.
Yeah, with the Anyway, just very, very fast. We've been identifying the land ownership in that settlement and seeing how the pattern of Palestinian ownership of that hill doesn't correspond with the suburban logic of that settlement, and in fact fragment that suburb into different zones, each belonging to different families, no? These are the Palestinian ownership. Only that some of those properties are actually public, and this is where our interventions would occur. So you have, it divides the fields into those it's not the whole settlements that would turn into a public space, but the fragments of the settlements that belong to the public that would become somehow nucleus of adaptation on an architectural scale within and between them, and always this level of destruction in between. This is another, this was rather theoretical, but here is something that we actually do. We got that asked by the mayor of this town next to Bethlehem to take care of a military base that was evacuated there. It's a rather remarkable base of several buildings on the top of a hill that has been piled over with earth for its fortification. It looks like the mouth of a volcano somehow. That has been evacuated and taken over, but Israeli settlers are coming back. They try to, like with the antenna, they try to, within this base, to create a new city, to use the houses of this evacuated base for a new town. And basically, it's a very mundane commission, what to do with this space. And this is a project we actually enact now in order to set claim for it and to deny the possibility for it to be used by the settlers. It had a certain revolving door occupation where activists were taking over erasing each other, graffiti, etc., as you can see. We operated rather straightforward as architects. I mean, what we did, we took the earth dike around it and kind of formed it in a way that would drain the system, but as well kind of create a very introvert in this mouth of the volcano that we call, where these are the homes that are in it. We realize that having a model is kind of operating politically, I mean, almost in the same way as the model in court before, Kind of opening discussion in a different way, having a model, having meetings around models within that context. But something that kind of occurred was our collaboration with the Palestine Wildlife Society, who told us, in fact produced this map for us, that a lot of the birds, obviously that Israel is a kind of a nexus for all the birds that go from Europe to Africa, They all pass over Palestine in autumn and spring, and they always choose the same points. One of them is that point over this military base, which becomes a certain Hitchcockian nightmare for a few days in autumn and spring, when thousands and tens of thousands of birds are coming there, and then obviously a whole microecology is kind of little predators and other things is developing around them. And the idea of the Nature Wildlife Society was, let's return that site to nature in a certain way. How do you offer it back to nature? You need to help in a certain way nature to accelerate the decay, to work on the decay, and decay is form making. How do you operate in decay, etc. And they told us, and we believed, that if we drilled holes into this, and if we perforated all the buildings around, the birds would come in there, and in fact plants as well would grow through it. And this is something that we are now in the kind of process of making, that kind of perforation of the building that would allow it to be nothing else but a certain park that would grow around that military base and would leave it in that kind of situation. So here's another kind of variation of the possible future archaeology of the occupation. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Eyal, for such a fascinating, while quite frightening, but I think finally exciting and hopeful talk. And if I could welcome you to now this table, and leading the Q&A will not be me this time, but instead two more doctors, this time from the School of Geography at the University of Nottingham, where Stephen Legg and Alex Vasudevan, apologies, Alex, if I mispronounced your surname.
Is there a doctor in the house?
Three, not medical, who both work in the human and cultural geography sections of the School of Geography. And I won't introduce their work at length, but only to say, because I think it could be interesting for you to know, that Alex has done a lot of work on applying performance theory to the Weimar Republic, the geography of the Weimar Republic, so obviously between the wars in geography, and more recently the squatters movement since the 70s in Germany. And then, on the other hand, Stephen has done a lot of research, sometimes from a Foucauldian perspective, on the spatial dynamic of colonial and post-colonial India, with special reference to Delhi. So different times and spaces from the occupied territories since the 70s, but perhaps there are kind of diagonal connections to be made there. So thank you very much for Alex and Stephen for being willing to lead this Q&A with Eyal.
Don't usually use a microphone, so I thought we'd try to keep this quite brief so that we could sort of segue as quickly as possible into a Q&A session. So what I thought I'd do, just by way of a really quick introduction, is to say maybe three things, not only about today's presentation, but also about the wider context in which we can situate this presentation with respect to the exhibition that's ongoing as well. So I thought I'd try to say a few things about that, and then pass on to Steve, who I think will also try to sort of situate today's talk within sort of a wider Foucauldian context as well, and then open it out to questions as well. So I think there are really three things that I wanted to say by way of introduction, and maybe perhaps three themes to draw out that hopefully will emerge again in questions. The first is just to think perhaps critically about the relationship between art and politics, which obviously runs through the exhibition, but I think it's been raised quite provocatively within today's talk as well. And I think just to go back to the show, I think the show attempts to sort of link or conjoin the aesthetic and the political, and that's kind of seen largely through the work of Michel Foucault. And of course, there's a particular interest in the show in drawing attention to a body of artwork that speaks back or flags up the sort of matrix of power relations subsumed under the heading of the prison or incarceration and so forth. I think some of the discussion in early events associated with the show of centered on what it means to actually invest art with a certain kind of political currency. And I can think of maybe a few projects that do so with greater urgency than what Eyal Weizman has been talking about this evening. I think it really prompts us to think quite critically, but also resourcefully, about what it means to do, but also to curate art in our current age of emergency, as it were. I think those of you familiar with the book Hollow Land will also be aware of some of the different challenges facing committed architectural research and practice in zones of conflict. And perhaps we can also extend that to notions of a sort of artistic activism as well. And some of this is sketched out in Eyal Weizman's book, especially with respect to some of the controversy that emerged out of a catalog, a civilian occupation, which certainly raised questions about what it means to do a certain kind of applied architectural research. So I think first thing I wanted to say was just to flag up again a pressing kind of theme, which is what it means to think about art politically. And I think that's something I guess we can come back to in the questions. The second theme is why geography, and why Steve and I, to some extent, as geographers. And I think it's become quite clear the sort of spatial resonance is coursing through tonight's talk. And it raises various questions that by their very nature are intrinsically geographical in theme, whether they be about geopolitics, about the role of cartography or mapping, and finally, with the last example, ecology or perhaps even environmental history. So various themes that have emerged that I think are profoundly geographical in scope. The other point I wanted to make with respect to geography perhaps is how in the last 20 years or so we've begun to see a sort of fruitful collaboration between artists and geographers more broadly, and perhaps most notably among historical and cultural geographers that have been working with the concept of landscape. And again, landscape's certainly a theme that's run through a lot of sort of aesthetic and critical interventions in the context of the occupied territories as well, and certainly a number of artists and critical commentators have seized on notions of landscape as a political technology as well, and I think that kind of links up to some of the things that were talked about in terms of tonight's presentations. I would suggest that invoking a notion of an elastic geography problematizes in very provocative ways some of the debates about landscape in the context of the occupied territories, and again, that's perhaps a point we could come back to later on. But to bring that back to artistic practice as well, I mean, something that emerged in one of the last talks was the ways in which a certain kind of contemporary artist practice, sort of post-minimalist contemporary art, for example, has also been in many respects resolutely geographical. And of course, there's numerous ways in which we could flag this up or highlight this in terms of site-specific work, earth or environment art, and for that matter, the kind of sort of installation-driven multimedia work, which seems to become de rigueur these days in contemporary artistic practice. And again, I wonder about questions of curation and installation and how they may actually be mobilized in the kinds of activist-driven work, or at least politically incisive kind of work that we've been talking about this evening. And I think perhaps this evening is a particularly suitable occasion to think about artistic intervention and its relationship both to political practice but also geographical discourse. So that sort of triangulation of art, geography, and politics I think is particularly pertinent to what we're talking about today. And the final point is to return back to the substantive sort of focus of the talk, which is to say something very briefly about the politics of walls or the politics of walling itself. And I think just very briefly, there's been a growing body of scholarship and research that has really tried to draw attention to the proliferation of walls as a response to the perceived failure of nation-state sovereignty, for example. So the language of borders, barriers, separation, apartheid, partition, enclosure have all become part of sort of a new geopolitical vocabulary, and one that I think is also itself a piece with the ascendancy of a particular kind of neoliberalism. And I think that economic argument often gets evacuated out of some of these geopolitical discourses, and I think that's something that certainly was flagged up by Eyal Weizman this evening. And so there are lots of questions that have been asked around this sort of debates about why walls, why the proliferation of walling. And the American political theorist Wendy Brown has recently sort of begun to work on this, and she's recently asked why this current proliferation of nation-state walls, for example, especially amidst all this widespread sort of euphoria or proclamations of global connectedness and sort of this anticipation of a world without borders, why do we see walls again? Why the interest or the desire for the construction of barricades, built of concrete, built of steel and barbed wire, when so many threats to the nation today, or at least so many perceived threats, are often miniaturized, clandestine, dispersed, or themselves networked? So why walls now, and how are they to be understood? And I think these are some of the kinds of questions that were, I think, first posed to Eyal Weizman in a recent roundtable discussion at the British Library, which I was lucky enough to be at in October. And of course, these are some of the points that I think have been not only raised, but developed very effectively this evening in the context of trying to think beyond some of these traditional notions of what it means to think about a wall as a sort of material artifact or an object, and to sort of push beyond those ways of thinking about walls. So to think about them around notions of the temporary or the elastic. And I think that not only challenges our notions of walling with all its connotations of something concrete and material, but I think also raises larger questions about where we think about walling in the context of wider political and economic forces. And perhaps one point we could return to later on is the wider neoliberal economic discourse, which seems to subtend much of this discourse or this sort of imperative or this desire for walling, which is quite interesting because I think it allies a certain understanding of violence with a certain understanding of the economic. But I think also to place these within wider theoretical and methodological sightlines, I think this talk speaks to the work of Michel Foucault and a whole series of provocative registers. And I think I'll pass on to my colleague Steve Legg to say a bit more about that.
Sure. Thank you. Is this one on? Hello? I'll use that. Okay, thank you. I just wanted to flag up some points that arose from the paper that would help us reflect on this. Is this? Oh, sorry. I'm getting stage directions. Is that better? Okay, right. Yeah, I just wanted to pick up some points that emerged from the paper that would help us think about how this helps us reflect on Foucault's work, but also how questions which arise from the sort of traditional Foucauldian literature might help us pose some questions to Eyal and think about this work in new ways. So I just wanted to raise 3 points. The first is the issue of scale and how Foucault raises lots of these questions of scale, which Eyal really, I think, reinterprets in really interesting and exciting ways. The second is to take up his prompt to consider Foucault's inversion of Clausewitz, who argued that war was politics pursued by other means, whereas Foucault inverted that and suggested that politics was in fact war pursued by other means. So to consider what that would mean in this situation. And the last is to consider how some people have been thinking about decolonization using some of Foucault's work on colonial governmentality. So the first issue is that of scale. And in geography and many other disciplines, the concept of scale is coming under renewed analysis. Ludmila Jordanova, who came to Nottingham recently, talked about scale, but she was talking about it in terms of visual culture and how, in terms of art, there's a renewed interest in scale, as in the scale at which you reproduce a work of art, the way in which you display and hang that art will have a massive effect on the way it's viewed and the way it's interpreted, which I think is fascinating, but it's a very different way to the way in which geographers are currently thinking about scale. And one of those ways is to question the extent to which scale is useful in framing methodologies and analysis, when what we should in fact be thinking of is the world in a much flatter sense, a world of networks that can overcome hierarchies. And this is a literature which is very much drawn upon Foucault's idea of power geometries, of relations between places and people through discourse. But what Eyal does so successfully, I think, is acknowledge that that flatness is interesting, but also that there are very forceful ways through which space is hierarchized vertically. And I think that's an absolutely essential rejoinder to that encouragement for us to look at relations in a Foucauldian sense, but to remember that there are very forceful power hierarchies which are still in force and often take a vertical geography as described here. But what I did want to do is that in the Hollow Land, that vertical imaginary is dominant. And I did just want to wonder how we might go back to notions of thinking about flatness and relationality to think about the broader geographies of what's happening here. So W.J.T. Mitchell was in Nottingham over summer, and some of the things he did raise were more networked about some of these technologies. So for instance, should we continually be reminded about where the money and technology is coming from? I saw those sort of cat bulldozers, which are very much sort of global brand. I'm just wondering, where do the bulldozers come from? Where does the technology actually come from? But then I was also thinking about the way in which these broader networks needn't just be about domination. And I noticed when Eyal mentioned that, you know, Orange was involved in many of these sort of mobile phone masts, I think people were quite surprised, but I think most people probably knew about the wall. And that's because it is such a visual and obvious icon that it has become to an extent globalized and is perhaps in some way a useful icon for a form of global resistance, or at least awareness and protest. So I'm just wondering how these things are actually networked out rather than just scaled up. So that's the point about scale. The second was the point you mentioned about war and Foucault, and how Foucault in the 1976 lectures entitled Society Must Be Defended suggested that we should think of society not as a peaceful place of communication and discourse, but as a realm in which wars were carried out between classes and races under the camouflage of peace. And I think that's a very interesting way for thinking about what's happening in Israel and the occupied territories, war through occupation. But what is interesting is that the next year Foucault dropped the metaphor completely of politics as war by other means and moved on to talk about biopolitics. And I think he continued to look at forms of internal conflict, but to look at them through this idea of biopolitics, the politicization of life. And I think one of the reasons he might have dropped the metaphor of war is that, unlike the warfare we have now, warfare traditionally isn't elastic enough, I think, to encapsulate all those different types of circular politics that invade people's very intimate spaces of their lives. And one thing which came out of that analysis, which became the whole governmentality school, is that these forms of government are able to internalize resistance, and through creating the impression of negotiation, can actually simply internalize resistance, not through a form of concession, but through a form of actually making forms of control more subtle. And I think it was really interesting for you to raise those points about how humanitarians now design checkpoints, humanitarians now design walls, and how that in some senses is a great achievement. It might win concessions, but in other senses is perhaps a depoliticization. But I was wondering at what sort of scales resistance might refuse to be internalized, and what the more successful forms of resistance are. And in the context of this series, what role art might play in that. And again, this is not something I'm really familiar with, but some of the literature on the wall has looked at how artists have used graffiti and decoration to deal with the wall. Some painting landscapes on the wall, but quite notoriously, Banksy, the UK's own sort of anonymous graffiti artist, went out to help the people of Palestine by doing some graffiti on the wall. And there was a really interesting interview, which I think W.J.T. Mitchell raised, where they were asking local people what they thought about this, and they hated it because they said, we don't want the wall to look nice. We want the wall to look ugly, as a reminder. So I was just thinking about what capacities do you think people have that don't become internalized for resistance? Because the Palestinian people do obviously seem to be incredibly good at resisting normalization. What sort of techniques do they have as resistance that don't simply become part of the machine? So that's point number two. And the last point is just some thoughts about decolonization, which you raised at the end. which I think is really, really interesting, and there's a lot of literature on. And it would seem that in the post-colonial geography literature, there are these two poles between what you do if you want to decolonize a landscape. One sort of pole is the Frantz Fanon mode. You violently insurrect, you take over that part of the city and you demolish it and you erase it from the landscape. The other is the sort of Gandhian principle of non-violent non-cooperation, where you move into the landscape but try to remove the violence from the landscape. So in my city, in Delhi, once the Viceroy's house was evacuated, when the British left, Gandhi wanted to turn it into a big hospital. But what Nehru did was just turn it into the President's Palace. And a lot of people have analysed how, in fact, in Delhi now you have exactly the same city, it's just got Indians in the Viceroy's Palace rather than the British. So I suppose the challenge is to find some way between there, and I think the model you outline of taking houses and finding new designs for them, I think is a really interesting way of doing that. But I was reminded of some of the cautionary tales that came out of Paul Rabenau's work on French North Africa, who used Foucault to think about security and the role of urban technologies in doing this. And what he showed was that in the French architects who tried to actually build houses in which Algerians could live, through not considering forms of life, cultures of inhabitation, cultures of family, through building houses that were designed for 2 rooms for a sort of linear family, ended up creating terrible health problems because of the extended families that try to cram into these houses, and through not bearing and not through consulting really local people in terms of their cultures of inhabitation. So I was just wondering, this project and this project which you're working on now, what level of consultation is feeding into this reimagining of these inherited landscapes? So I don't know if you want to respond to that, or if we could just...
Could I please? I mean, it was great. I thank you. I really enjoyed the 2 comments. I have a very short memory, and I didn't take notes in your... so
He's got notes.
So, I mean, let me start with yours. And I don't know if it's like... It's probably not answers, but maybe like even a set of questions for you, no? I mean, I think that let's take the kind of the war and politics inversion or kind of model in Foucault. I mean, for me, in a certain sense, I mean, power relations are everywhere, no? Power relations are everywhere, i.e. that is the conflict, no? Everything is political. Every form of social interaction is kind of political. In terms of kind of being conflictual, no? I mean, that is kind of like, let's say, the model that is promoted there. But I think that this is not, I don't know if this is what, I don't know if he really should have used politics there as the term for that. I mean, for me, kind of that forms of, the results of, let's say, the accommodation of conflicting desires, of conflicting interest on a diffused or, bipolar way is not exactly what politics is. No, I mean, politics needs to be, and I'm trying to lead out of that to your last point, no, about what can happen, no. So because we are always, everything that we do is kind of part of a certain conflict. It's kind of it's informed by and manipulated by power relations, no? And that is I wonder if politics could be thought outside of that economy, no? And something that actually questions the ways in which that power relations are kind of producing their facts, no? So like the questioning of the arena itself, no? For me, what the human rights guys, although they are in conflict with the government, etc., no, operating within the West Bank, they're not producing politics. And I think in that I agree with you. No, you said it's a certain depolitization there. They arrive at an accommodation of their power, no, that they can mobilize by, intelligent or not intelligent legal action, the mobilization of international opinion, no, and they can kind of like reform that. But still, this game happens within the borders and rules of the Israeli state and the occupation, no? And I think that the kind of, I mean, and this is kind of typical of a lot of forms of resistance on human rights, on humanitarian, on civil right level, no? That are kind of, let's call it ameliorative, no? Or reforming. And there is something that maybe I just don't understand well enough in Foucault, no? His relation to reform, which seems quite positive sometimes, no? I mean, in a sense, I'm not doubting his revolutionary credentials, no? But in fact, within the kind of power relations that he's, this sort of immanent of power, no? You can always arrive at a certain kind of reform that comes out of a momentary balance of powers as it rearticulates itself, no? So everything kind of becomes ameliorative. Maybe it's too fast, but there's a kind of a system in which your operation improve perhaps the situation kind of on the ground. That's the kind of the lesser evil, no? Sure. A certain lesser evil approach that is really at the foundation of thinking humanitarianism and human rights approach to conflict and kind of in the way in which, I mean, if human rights is the way in which the ethical is introduced into kind of the political field, no? It's basically kind of, it doesn't often challenge systems, it ameliorates them, no? So the question is, could there be forms of intervention that are actually, not resorting to a sort of complete disengagement of critique, no? I.e., forms of operation on the ground that are transformative rather than, accepting that rules of the game, let's say, no? And I think these are moments that are interesting for me, no? So, because, when I think about that, no? If I, in my discussion with those lawyers, no? And kind of explaining them, in fact, you are just helping reproduce and reorganize the realities of the occupation. What is the alternative to that? Kind of to abandon that field, no? To abandon that field, literally the field of the farmer, no? That one can save, or the field of power here. And I think here there is another kind of paradox that comes, and that is a certain position that I don't find acceptable in political resistance, and that is the mobilization of pain for political purpose, i.e., only through abandonment, no, you would make the crisis so deep that political transformation would occur, no, that politics appeal, no, or kind of this Marxist idea of, accentuating the contradictions, etc. No, because here I think, in as much as one can apply it on oneself, no. As an Israeli, I cannot ask for more pain to be the part of Palestinian life, so that, for example, my political ideal, which is, let's say, a one-state solution there, would come. Transformation would come out of pain that is applied on somebody else. So the question is really how to allow ameliorative actions on the ground to call into question the entire kind of systems, no, that are reproducing power effectively. How can something be both immanent, no, you partake, and therefore I don't know if it's true, no, but I'm looking for those moments, and I don't know if I find them in the way in which in the model the wall actually crosses the line to the other side, and therefore put into crisis the whole notion of the wall, no, right? Because I know that Muhammad Dakhle, the lawyer, is not a partitionist, he's a one-statist, no? But he kind of, I don't know if it worked, and I think it may have been too subtle a kind of move. But I'm looking for these kind of moments where intervention in the here and now, in the possible, can open a horizon for much more radical transformations. And I think that the issue, for example, of for us, the work on the settlements is incredibly compromised, no? Because the conditions for that project to materialize are a very compromised American, Israeli-backed partial evacuation, no? Like in Gaza. but could you operate within, the opportunity that gives you to actually open up, I don't know, we are kind of, maybe I'm talking too much, I don't know, to open up a possibility for, for much more radical transformations, no? I.e., can the kind of like the transformation of the single family house, which is the unit, the molecular level of colonialism, no? In that sense, can designate a kind of transformation beyond even the 67 line. I do not know if that. Now, there was a practical question about decolonization consultation. I mean, the project, what it is this arena, no? I mean, it's not a design project by us. What I've shown you here is a result, of like the many kind of, the office is Palestinian, no? I mean, it's based in Palestine. The workers are mainly Palestinian. There as well international architects that are working with us, but it exists in kind of on a civil society level on various scales, both in work with Palestinian NGOs, with universities, with landowners. I mean, in fact, we have it's organized around Wednesday meetings. Started Saturday meetings, but then it turned to Wednesday meetings. So every Wednesday, we would kind of like have this sort of crit of what we've done, and we'll invite landowners and all stakeholders, in fact, in that process to come and discuss that. Now you asked something about scale, and I'm happy that you kind of differentiated between scale and size. No, I mean it's not just something is big. Scale is about relations of size, right? Size relations, and I think here it's again that kind of idea of a model or laboratory, which is absolutely important and essential. I mean, in fact, that idea of model or laboratory is a structure, a fundamental idea within the history of Zionism. No, I mean in Herzl's, kind of manifesto, Alt-Neuland, no, Tel Aviv, which is it's written as a novel. No, it's a kind of discussion between two characters. He's saying that the kind of the colonial project of Palestine, which you then imagine as a German-speaking colony, no. Could only operate if it becomes a certain model for possible colonization, no? For much more enlightened colonization. No? So the idea of Palestine, the return of the Jews to Palestine, is seen as a kind of as a point of historical example. It could only operate as a kind of as opening up the future through and a kind of a relation of model. And then he adds a kind of a very sort of unfortunate sentence. Says, only then would the Germans realize that the Jews were always Germans, no? So only when we have enacted that kind of laboratory. But Israel-Palestine has always operated as a sort of kind of model or laboratory, kind of a worst case scenario now for, the war on terror, etc., etc. But there's a lot of kind of model relations within my work and in the way that I think about them, no? From the house, the idea of the house as a kind of a model, the operating on the architectural on a small scale, rather than operating on a master planning level, as a kind of a tool to open up the possibility for much larger transformations is one of those things. And but there's things are kind of understood in terms of other things is something that kind of keeps on kind of appearing there in the work. I'm absolutely fascinated about the kind of Gandhi and I want to talk to you. I want the references later for that.
Do we want to? Should we open up for questions? Oh, it's working now, obviously.
I'll be the mic guy.
Thanks very much. Yeah, I think, is it on? Yeah, Brad. Yeah, just going back to what you were saying there about the human rights approach, and really it's taking an amelioration, it's going for an ameliorative approach to the facts on the ground almost. In some ways, I agree with you, the human rights-based approach ends up almost retrofitting what exists. And when we look at, just from your talk there, I notice we pay a lot of attention to acts of commission, as in walls, architecture, how it's negotiated, not as a solid object, but as something that is, socially and politically negotiated. I also think that we should also pay attention to the acts of omission, which specifically affects the Palestinian population. So the informal growth of cities, what effect that has on its economic sustainability, its developmental sustainability, and its ability to sustain life, because that has an enormous disciplining effect from a Foucauldian sense. The inability to control one's land and the inability to control one's employment opportunities or family life, or just through acts of, I don't know, almost like what the occupation benefits from an uncontrolled population in some ways, that they don't have a centralized mechanism to control their own architecture, in the slum dwellings. I just thought I'd throw that out there.
Maybe we take some, it was a comment more, no? So I appreciate that.
Other questions? Yep.
Is there something I need to refer to in your...
Hi. I'm not an expert in this, so forgive me if this is a really silly question, but I was really interested by your talk, so thank you for that. And I was fascinated when you talked about this destruction of walls and the sort of destruction of architecture, and I think you said something along the lines of, along with this destruction of walls and architecture, you have the destruction of protection and privacy, and that really fascinated me, that struck me. And so I was wondering if I just wanted to draw that out a little bit, and if you could say a bit more about the effect of the occupation on this sort of, dichotomy between public and private, or personal and political, has both in terms of the destruction of architecture, but also in terms of, other effects of the occupation, has that sort of dichotomy been, how has that been affected, I suppose, is my question. Thanks.
Thank you. I think that the kind of what really needs to be studied more is the effect of the let's say penetration of war into the most private spaces had. It's not only in Palestine, no. It's in. I think that the kind of the experience of being under occupation, if it's in Iraq or Afghanistan, is that kind of inability to protect your private space, no? That violence can, that the house is not, kind of the. I think that division of kind of classic division of this is how cities work, no? The public space could only be public if there is a space of retreat from it, no? A space that is not public, no? Maybe it's kind of like Arendt's reading of, the classic city. The minute that you break that, you destroy the whole balance, no? If you destroy the public, the private, you don't even have a public, no? It's not that just everything becomes a public space, no? Everything just becomes washed out by occupation. It's taken off, and it is that kind of relation that is being destroyed. In a certain way, there's been, some of those very macabre discussions in Palestine, because there were two attacks simultaneously. No, there was this Nablus one that I described when they walked through walls, and there was Jenin, no, when they actually destroyed with bulldozers, the Haussmannized this camp, no, they opened new roads, etc. But what remained in Jenin, even though the town was destroyed, was still, kind of the property rights was still like there, floating, no? The kind of the boundaries of spaces, even though they weren't there, and then they were kind of built into that space again. And I think that in Nablus now, that kind of form of devastation that happened really reconfigured the city, no? Because some of those destructions, I've just heard, have been actually kind of not institutionalized, no, but kind of managed in relations between neighbors, etc. No, I mean that line that separates the private from another private, or the private from the public, has been destroyed as well consciously. No, so I think that this is really a very important aspect. And about art and politics or activism, no, I think it's exactly what we need to question is forms of activism. No, I mean forms of activism that have a kind of immediate achievable aim. No, that are but have no vision, transformative vision beyond the achievable aim. No, I mean we can fight for, I don't know, against that library closing, etc. But what is our image of the city? No, how do we imagine cities to be? How do we imagine public space to operate? No, what kind of public institutions we need? What kind of relation of money or private enterprise in a city we want or we do not allow? No, I mean there need to be. I think that kind of activism that operates without, a frame. And it doesn't need to be a frame of certainty, no, but without a kind of a political, ethical frame, is just lost. No, is for me it's meaningless. No, because there is no. It's just part of the kind of how urban space is managed. No, and kind of how a new balance is achieved. No, and I think the role of art there, maybe, or one of its roles, is not just kind of like to mobilize for action, but to kind of to open the sensible, no, into ways of imagining other life possible, no, of exactly kind of on that point of radical transformation. So I'm not saying artists should draw like utopian cities, etc., but that the kind of sensibility that is captured by art or by architecture, no, through the aesthetic, is not about mobilizing passions for immediate action and activism, but exactly a way to find to kind of to seek that transformation, no, to open the imagination, to open the field, the visual field or the sensible field, into kind of ideas of much more radical transformations. So, I mean, sorry, I'm looking at you, but, I mean, this is the discussion that, I don't know, perhaps you agree, no? Or not, but...
Can I just follow up? Well, I think just to follow up was partly a question and partly a comment, I guess, is one of the things that sort of emerged out of your talk was a recasting of the notion of utopia. And often utopias, in recent years at least, by cultural commentators, have been seen in pejorative terms. Yeah. But it strikes me that you're investing the concept, at least, with some interesting potentials that perhaps aren't normative per se, but certainly open up radical possibilities that aren't simply reactive, but have a wider durée or wider lifetime in many respects in terms of using architecture, but also using public space, which was going to be my perhaps question or comment, is that one of the things that emerged near the end was a sort of concern with the common good, or the commons.
The common.
As a response, perhaps quite literally, to enclosure of particular kinds of spaces. And that kind of relationship is quite interesting, the way in which public space becomes utopian and mediated partly through architecture. I don't know if you want to say anything more about that. But
no, maybe I think that, I mean, this is something that I'm maybe kind of developing towards, no? I'm kind of accepting the utopian much more as a category of action, no? And again, no, I mean, as you say, not in an immediate kind of innocent, normative way of some modernist utopias, but a way to imagine a possibility beyond the present, beyond the existing, no? Which is a kind of a transformation on a level that is not an articulation of relation within, re-articulation of relation within the existing, no? Now, this is completely abstract, but sometimes I think one needs a kind of strategic or tactical essentialism, no? In that a certain flattening of complexity, no? As well. And for me, and if you read the book, no, it's kind of like endless, sort of, what can be done with space? It's like this endless kind of complexity that is there, and many times I was asked by people who were looking at the work that we were doing, why is it so like simple? No, why is it simplified? No, and I think that sometimes you need to kind of undo difference, no, in order kind of to act and to designate a kind of a possibility beyond that which is existing. No, difference is what exists. No, we need to go kind of how Badiou said, indifference to difference. No, to be indifferent to differences, in a certain way, is a kind of this part of strategic essentialism that is necessary sometimes to operate in environments like that without kind of just being part of that, endless complexity of rearticulation of power relations, of this permanent war, supposedly war, which is politics, but is not political at all. No, it's just power relations. It's not politics.
Right. Yeah. Any last contributions? One more and we'll close.
Hi, I suppose my question really is about, excuse me, the NGOs and human rights activists on the ground, while helping the material welfare of the Palestinians, in this case. Is there any way they can do this without being co-opted into the state to legitimise what's going on the ground? So help the population without...
This is a great... I mean, this is the question, no? Because I am not... I think there's been too fast and too easy this complete dismissal of human rights work, no? In fact, the people who are on the ground there in Palestine are the best people we have, no? I mean, these are really committed young international activists, Israeli and Palestinians, no? They form as well. What I find very interesting in that human rights work is when it forms binational platforms of action, no? So for a binationalist like me, no, who seeks a kind of a single state, binational state, these could become political platforms. I mean, in fact, it's the only binational kind of platform of action that exists now, or is on the human rights, and kind of on a certain resistance to the occupation level, no? The question is, how do you frame this action, no? If it's all about, improving the checkpoints, moving the wall, or do you offer an image beyond, not only an image, no? I mean, are you working towards a certain reality which is outside of that existing kind of rearticulation of power relations? Not only that you hold it in your mind, how you transform it into the techniques of your own action, no? And this is the question. The question of techniques, no? Of how you actually, if you go to court on behalf of a Palestinian farmer and you save her or his field, I think it's great as well, no? But how do you make that wheeled, geared into kind of much larger, kind of worldview and ideal that you work towards, no? That, I mean, for me, that is the question. Now you ask what exactly, and I would say, in every situation it's a different thing. What you need to be aware of this paradox. You need to accept, in my opinion, no? A paradox is not resolved by pushing the pendulum one way or the other, no, saying no human rights work, no, I mean, we'll do nothing, we'll let it rot, and then Messiah would come, and, redemption, etc., all that, dollarist kind of perspective, no? How do you actually work, but work differently, no? So, I mean, here, just in terms of that lecture, you have two examples. You could say that shit, no? But, one in the wall, in the case of the wall, is that through that, and there is a certain discussion about that glitch in the model in court, no? Where it kind of allows, going on record, the whole questioning of the politics of separation, no? And the other one, a very ameliorative thing, no? Putting public institutions in the context of domination, still in Gaza or in the West Bank, are they opening or not, no? A kind of a possibility to imagine a much more radical process of decolonization, no? In relation to the ground, which for us is the most important, no? The ground ownership and ground use, which is really how Israeli domination, how colonialism operates, no? It's the most, kind of immediate currency tool or weapon colonialism. No. So anyway, maybe it's a good point to stop, or you want to say something?
I think we're done. I'm sure we want to thank you again, but I'll leave that to Alex. I think.
Yeah, I think it could go on and on, but I'm conscious that we've overrun our time, regrettably. But with more time and with a bit more warmth, I'm sure this could continue for a good hour. Thank you so much, Eyal, for such a stimulating presentation.
Thank you.